Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We're going to continue chapter 6, Emerging from Trauma, Loss, and Isolation. The 4 stages of recovery, the story of Ralph. The needs to clarify psychological distress, overcome isolation, surmount shame, self-doubt, and guilt, and find meaning in a post-trauma life are all issues still confronting many gay survivors of early and later life trauma. All are well illustrated in the story of Ralph, a 61-year-old HIV-negative survivor of the early epidemic and former long-term resident of San Francisco. Ralph tells a familiar story, but with a better outcome than many. It offers useful insight for other older men who lived through the early epidemic, as well as for much younger men who have lived through other traumas, but have the youthful advantage of resilience and still evolving futures. Ralph had been co-founder of a successful San Francisco clothing manufacturer with a chain of stores in several major cities. A few years after Tom's death from complications of HIV, Ralph sold the company. He was financially well off, and several years later he moved to Laguna Beach, a Southern California coastal town with a significant gay community. After the move, Ralph's new partner of 2 years, Kevin, continued to run a small architectural design and construction firm. I had first met Ralph many years ago in the middle of the early epidemic, and I asked him if he would have a conversation with me for this book. Unlike the many who wanted to avoid revisiting painful memories, he seemed eager to talk about his experience in and after the early epidemic, and we spoke on the phone for several hours. The following is a highly condensed transcript from that conversation. I'm glad you asked me to do this because normally no one asks to talk about it. I'm sitting here staring at a picture of Tom on my desk, and the first thing I find myself wanting to say to you is that I'm damaged. We're supposed to be strong and move on, but this is part of my being. It's who I am. I feel it inside me. Kevin is 48 and was not really around the epidemic, and he's different, and I can't talk to him much about it. It's hard to describe the damage, but it's given me a certain seriousness, a feeling that bad things happen, like around the corner, and then the optimism comes crashing down. I feel changed. Tom was one of the first to get sick, and we kept it a secret because we feared that people would stop patronizing the stores. A lot of the guys have moved here to Laguna Beach from San Francisco, and I see such blankness in older gay men here. And when I visit San Francisco, they're shut down, and younger men are just detached from the whole thing. Very occasionally an older man will bring it up, usually as a political thing, and I'm surprised even by that. Then if you get them going, suddenly they're talking about how many people they knew who got sick and died, how scared they were, how relieved they are not to have HIV, or how hard it's been having HIV. But this is rare, and I've mostly had to work through it on my own. The day Tom was diagnosed was the worst day of my life. It wasn't just that he was dying, it was everything. Several times a week, we'd go for a long drive after work, sometimes 4 or 5 hours, just to be alone, no one else around, no phone, barely talking, just gliding along in the dark. It was our own world, and it was peace. Tom once said, "When we're alone in the car driving, it's the only time I feel safe." I felt the same way. One day when Tom was really sick and looked terrible, we had arrived back in the city on our way home at about 1 in the morning. We were waiting at a red light, and the car pulled up alongside, and the guy looked at Tom and started shouting, "AIDS, fags, AIDS." I don't know what the guy said. This was San Francisco I'm talking about. I felt terrible for Tom, but I was traumatized by this too. I was ashamed by it, even though I wasn't positive. I felt like Tom and I were successful gay people, but this made me feel like trash, that I'd never be valuable enough. It was like being back in junior high and high school, which was a terrible time for me, all those feelings, and here it was happening again. Ours was a gay business, a very successful one that didn't cater particularly to gay people, but to all of San Francisco, including a lot of tourists and other people across the country. We wanted to show them we could do this, but there was a lot of stigma about the owners being gay. There was very obviously a feeling that gay men couldn't do it, couldn't really excel at something like this. And to really excel, you had to sort of duck down a little, stay under the radar, and not make yourself too conspicuous. So I was dealing with all this, and then there's the epidemic going on, and Tom is dying. The best thing we could think of was hiding out in the car. And then that asshole starts yelling at us, and after that I would never look at people in other cars. I could hardly look at anyone. I asked Ralph if he thought of himself as a survivor. That's hard to say because I was never sick. I guess you're not supposed to say you're a survivor if you're negative, but I've pushed through a lot of fear and heartache, and I've had to work hard, deliberately, to build a satisfying life. You know, I never had anal sex because I always had hemorrhoids. I guess you could say that hemorrhoids saved my life. My doctor once asked me if I wanted to see a therapist. He thought I might have emotional things to work out because I wasn't having anal sex. So I didn't know if I'm a survivor. I guess I really am. I see a lot of negative men around me that I think of as survivors, though I haven't heard anyone use the term. A lot of them are incredibly isolated. They're very isolated. And I try to extend myself not to let that happen. I have them over for dinner. I've become sort of the gay Pearl Mesta of Laguna Beach, the hostess of the town. One man said to me, "You're my only social life," which shocked me. So I make a big effort to keep a community going, mostly with the dinners and barbecues and then other kinds of things like camping trips, where 6 or 8 of us will go up to the mountains for 4 days. I try to plan things so I can get people together who are compatible and can talk to each other. I've taken this on as my responsibility, and not just for them, but for me. It's so easy to just drift off and suddenly realize that you haven't seen anyone in a month. I lived like that for years after Tom died and before I met Kevin, and I don't want to do it again. There are also 5 of us, the English muffins we call ourselves, who get together for breakfast a couple of times a week. And these are guys I can really talk to about anything. I started it on Meetup a few years ago, but then we went private. The muffins are my therapy now. We talk about a lot of serious things, feelings about everything, and 2 of them also lost partners. But all 5 of us lived through AIDS. 2 are HIV positive. Without the muffins, I would probably have a therapist again. I guess I didn't mention Marty. After Tom died, I felt completely lost and I was in therapy for about 2 years, and that helped a lot. Mostly Marty just sat there and listened to me, and it's amazing how helpful that was. Every now and then he'd say something incredible, a flash of light. I remember one day I said to him that I felt I must be boring him, that I was just talking about the same things week after week, and I felt like I was just digging myself in deeper, just going over the painful past again and again. Marty said, "You're feeling broken, in pieces. By talking, you're finding ways to put the pieces back together," or something like that. It was very, very helpful. Slowly, during and after the therapy, I'm talking 4, 5, 6 years after, I had gained confidence. Then, when Kevin and I moved down here, I started to work with kindergarten kids as a volunteer, and it's made me happier. I've been doing it for years now. Children need help. They are not sick. They're not dying. They're enthusiastic about life. Terrible things have not happened to them. Helping them gives me purpose, a reason for my life. Tom lived most of his life helping other people. If things go down the tubes and we have another Republican president, I'll just volunteer more. I'm stronger than a lot of people, but it's there, the damage. I'm not one of those people who want to live forever. but I never say this to people because they get mad at me. The AIDS thing shaped that in me. So, am I a survivor? I could say that I've learned again to have a satisfying life, but when it's over, it won't be a huge tragedy. Tom used to say to me that at the end he would have died twice. The first time was the diagnosis, the second time when he died. I'll have died twice too. The first time was when Tom got diagnosed. Stage 1. Emerging from isolation. Judith Herman discusses attention to isolation as a prerequisite to her 3 stages of recovery, but does not include it as a distinct first stage. I give isolation the emphasis of its own stage because many gay men carry a lifelong history of stigma and consequent isolation, and any later life trauma only builds upon and exacerbates that experience. Even as human connections and community are fundamental to recovery from trauma, isolation is now endemic in gay communities. Ralph intuitively understood this and was able, as the Pearl Mesta of Laguna Beach, to reintroduce himself into a communal life that helped provide meaning. Echoing much of Erickson's work, Herman tells us that in post-trauma isolation, we have lost basic capacities for trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, and intimacy. Just as these capabilities are originally formed in relationships with other people, they must be reformed in such relationships. In stage 1, the connections that help restore our basic capacities are found in many different forms. Other people and whole communities bear witness, which in itself is validating and strengthening for a survivor. The witness is able to listen caringly and without vicarious traumatization. He does not participate in denial of the trauma, and he does not dismiss the emotional aftermath as unintelligible or unwarranted. The witness recognizes the survivor, and that recognition provides the foundation for the survivor's recovery of himself. Marty listened to Ralph while Ralph put the pieces back together. Relatively few heterosexual Americans have the experience that would allow them to bear witness to a gay survivor of the epidemics, and gay men must largely provide such witness for one another. Our bonds as gay men carried us through the epidemic, and they can help us through the aftermath. But we need to both speak and listen to one another, form groups of men to talk about their histories and feelings, and sometimes seek individual psychotherapists when that is possible. The Medias Institute for Gay Men's Health was founded by Spencer Cox and John Volker to define and publicize the current issues in gay men's psychological health. Both men were engaged survivors of the early epidemic. Medias was essentially an effort to initiate stage 1 to gain attention and support for those dwindling away in unaddressed isolation, emotional pain, and destructive substance use, and its white papers were penned in an intelligent, well-researched, eloquent voice. Cox and Volker were met with a veritable wall of disinterest and denial, but the busy agendas of gay communities must make room for a media's agenda that stands shoulder to shoulder with the other agenda items that have garnered so much public attention. Commenting on Vietnam combat veterans, Herman tells us that they refuse to be forgotten. Moreover, they refused to be stigmatized. They insisted upon the rightness, the dignity of their distress. Gay survivors of gay wars must also refuse to insist. Stage 2. Safety. My stage 2 is Judith Herman's first formal stage of recovery. Moving survivors to a place of both physical and emotional safety is widely considered the first stage of recovery from any trauma. With others' help and on his own initiative, Ralph slowly built a sense of emotional safety. During his teenage years, he had felt endangered, and during the early epidemic, he and Tom had again found themselves in a dangerous world in which they felt safe with each other only during their midnight drives. Safe before the traffic light verbal assault that had revived memories of painful personal histories. In grief and without companionship following Tom's death, Ralph sought out a therapist, then began a relationship with Kevin, and ultimately moved from the concentrated trauma in San Francisco to the relative peace of Laguna Beach. It was through his connections to his therapist, Kevin, the Laguna Beach community, and children who had not had terrible things happen to them, that Ralph found a sense of emotional safety. When we spoke, I sensed a man who had surely been injured by early life and later trauma, but who had also now constructed a purposeful life, largely free of a sense of present danger. Today, many gay men carry a variable mix of trauma from the ongoing late epidemic, the 15-year early epidemic, and early life stigmatization and abuse that originated in the family and often continues into adulthood. For such men, a sense of physical and emotional safety is often more elusive than for survivors of acute, later life, shorter-term trauma. Because it is ongoing, the late epidemic does not permit absolute physical and thus emotional safety for sexually active young men. Even as prevention approaches such as PrEP provide excellence, if imperfect, results, the possibility of contracting HIV remains, and today about 2.4% of all gay men contract HIV annually. Although HIV is no longer the threat many feel it to be, it is still a threat of considerable medical and social significance. Particularly on behalf of young men, we could significantly reduce the level of physical threat and its emotional consequences if gay community leaders and spokespeople focused on the issue of the late epidemic. We have had HEART for more than 20 years, and it has provided HIV-positive men significant assurance against HIV-related illness and death. And it has made the transmission of HIV from those on regular HEART regimens virtually impossible. For HIV-negative men, we also have approved pharmaceuticals for both post- and pre-exposure treatment and prophylaxis, known respectively as PEP and PrEP. Both provide high efficacy against established new infection. These powerful interventions come with an obvious catch. They are available only to informed people with access to money or medical insurance, HIV-knowledgeable care, and supportive physicians who do not stigmatize gay lives and sexuality. One would have expected gay community agendas to focus on these important needs, but on the whole, they have not. It is young gay men, the future of gay male communities, who most suffer the consequences of this inattention. The majority of gay men have lived in a hostile world for much of their lives, and in the aftermath of adult trauma, they need not a restoration, but a first experience of safety. American society is still largely hostile to gay people, and the emotional aftermath of trauma in such a world leaves many gay men with a sense of self that is characterized by internal division, self-doubt, and isolation that is meant to conceal shame and the shameful self from others. The authentic acceptance of gay people would provide an authentic sense of emotional safety, and if that acceptance were felt only by gay men themselves, it would transform gay lives beyond anyone's wildest hopes for legal victories. The absolute conviction of gay people about the right and rightness of gay lives might even, over time, transform a society whose stigmatization is now only nurtured by the shame of gay people themselves. It is in authentic, unstigmatized lives that people find emotional safety. That objective cannot be accomplished by individuals alone. Emotional safety is not simply an internal state. It is a sense of safety in the world and the company of others. Stage 3. Grieving and talking through. Recovery from both trauma and loss requires grieving. For clarity of discussion, I divide grieving into 2 consecutive stages: talking through and working through, although the actual process is never that defined and linear. Many imagine that grieving is painful, which is true, and less true that the pain invariably begets nothing more than pointless, self-indulgent wallowing in the past, from which one should simply move on. Such advice is often heard from and for gay men living in the aftermath of traumatic early life experience and the two epidemics, and those caught wallowing do often feel shame for their weakness and self-indulgence. As a psychotherapist who has worked with many survivors of trauma and loss, I know that simply moving on is rarely productive, and that usefully conducted talking and working through are powerfully reparative. Only with active grieving and the aftermath of trauma do we find partially restored or new, authentically expansive, rich, and humanly engaged lives. The first step in grieving, in which we allow ourselves to bring painful memories to consciousness, is the step we most often hope to avoid. Unfortunately, the step is an essential part of the foundation for a useful grieving process. Herman describes it as the recovery and cathartic reliving of traumatic memories. Most gay people already know this first step. It begins with the private, conscious acknowledgement of who one is, which gay people often call coming out to myself. The coming out entails remembering and reliving traumatic memories of life in the closet. The next step is to seek support by coming out to others, and with the support of those witnesses to begin searching for a gay life by grieving the loss of the life that came before. In the grieving, we work through the loss of an old self that we and others had hoped for or expected, and unfortunately, we must often grieve the loss of family, previous intimate relationships, and both casual and important friendships. Only in grieving and relinquishing these losses can we make room for a new sense of self and the life it might offer, a life born of a sense of relative wholeness and self-acceptance, an authentic life. Grieving almost invariably requires support by others who bear witness. As they first bear witness for us, we learn to bear witness for ourselves, and to then bear witness for others, who in turn bear further witness for us. This is the nature of a supportive community. We mutually listen to, comprehend, and care for one another. From Marty's first bearing witness for him, Ralph learned to bear witness to his own life, and then later found a community of men who mutually bore witness for one another. In his grieving for both Tom and for who he had been before his trauma and loss, Ralph found healing. All useful psychotherapy is fundamentally about bearing witness. The therapist helps a person discover and be himself in the presence of another, and that experience of caring and acceptance helps heal a previously fragmented and divided self. At the end of his long, thoughtful process, Ralph was not one of those people who want to live forever, but he had found a way back to a satisfying, connected life with a sense of purpose, pleasure, and reasonable happiness. In my impression, Ralph was probably as healed as any survivor of serious, long-term trauma can be, and for good reason. He did not relegate his feelings to unconsciousness. He actively explored them. As with consciously forgotten but disturbing dreams, in the aftermath of real-life trauma, the feelings live on in us. They live on mostly enduringly, disruptively, and destructively when we deny and imprison them, preserved like spores in our unconsciousness, where they continue to have undesired and unrecognized influences on our social lives. Ralph allowed his feelings into consciousness and he talked them through, but that was not enough. Even when feelings are thoroughly talked through, we discover that insight alone, unimplemented and unconnected insight, does not change a life. One simply remains fixed in the traumatic memories, which can beget more pain than resolution, the very outcome that many fear. Ralph needed to go beyond the exploration of his feelings, and he did. He implemented his insight in new connections and purpose. Stage 4. Working through and the story of Bill. Herman calls this final stage of recovery reconnection, but in talking about gay men, I am calling it working through for two reasons. First, because of long-standing developmental histories of trauma and isolation in a world of stigmatizing families and communities, Many young gay men have nothing to reconnect to. They must find authentic connections for the first time in their lives. Second, the idea of reconnecting too easily implies the often heard simplistic notion that the solution to trauma and isolation is to get out of the house, make some friends, and be social. That is not at all Herman's intent, and as she well knows and articulately states, and the story of Bill illustrates, the stage of recovery is a complex internal effort undertaken in a social context. Reconnecting is not about simply acting socially in the world. The need for social connection in this critical final stage of recovery is one of the important reasons that therapy groups are so helpful for working through an approach that Herman discusses. Such groups afford a degree of support and understanding that is simply not available in the survivor's ordinary social environment. Groups provide the possibility not only of mutually rewarding relationships, but also of collective empowerment. The group as a whole has a capacity to bear and integrate traumatic experience that is greater than that of an individual member. Gay communities have something important in common with small, structured survivor groups. Whether from early or later life trauma, gay communities, particularly those of younger men just coming out in the world, or older survivors of the early epidemic, are often groups of men living with feelings of alienation from family, society, and other gay men. Groups of such men might thus hold the power to bear and integrate traumatic experience that is greater than that of any individual member. This is why so many young men migrate to gay communities in search of working through early developmental trauma. Whether our communities and community politics are actually up to the task is another matter. When he first came to see me, Bill, 47 and gay, was living alone in San Francisco. His father had died when Bill was 7. A single child, he had continued to live with his working mother in Idaho Falls until the age of 14, when his mother died following a surgery. Having grown up with his parents in borderline poverty, Bill then moved to live with his well-to-do aunt and uncle in Salt Lake City, where he stayed until the age of 18. Then moving to a rented room, Bill supported himself for a year with odd jobs before moving to San Francisco. He had known since the age of 12 that he was gay, but because of the strong stigma attached to it in Idaho and Utah, he had done little exploration. Bill arrived in San Francisco on his quest for self-discovery in 1987 at the age of 19 and bore first-hand witness to the spiraling epidemic. Bill had a lot of strength. He had grown up with a great deal of necessary independence and responsibility and had developed an authentic, resolute self-sufficiency. After moving to San Francisco, he dated a bit, but he had never had a sustained relationship. Shortly after arriving, he began working as an escort, which he continued for 2 years, and he told me that it had been a fun way to make a decent living and learn more about sex. He described his clients as usually nice, generous, older married men, and I was almost always the top, which I prefer. The clients often took Bill to fancy restaurants, and he began thinking about the importance of mushrooms. When I first met him for therapy in 2015, Bill was the founder and owner of a 20-year-old company that grew and distributed specialty mushrooms for high-end Northern California restaurants and gourmet groceries. He was financially successful and said he enjoyed his work. He continued to date, now only sporadically, and felt he was somewhat depressed and lonely. He presented himself as cheerful, animated, and gregarious, but I sensed the limited range of feeling behind the presentation. Unmodulated cheerfulness often suggests underlying emotional constriction, and Bill seemed too cheerful, particularly for a man who was living with so little companionship and intimacy. During our initial work, much of what we discussed was Bill's history of loss and trauma. For the first time, he was slowly able to recall, re-experience, and discuss the trauma of his childhood and the trauma during his first decade in San Francisco. He recalled tremendous emotional pain at the time of his father's death, which had occurred in a violent work-related accident in which his father's face and upper torso had been badly burned. Bill had forgotten most of this, but in our conversations, he was slowly able to recall an astonishing amount of detail. He told me that it had been a closed-casket funeral despite his angry 7-year-old protest. He had wanted to see his father, and no one would tell Bill why he was not allowed to, except that something had happened to his face. After the funeral, Bill was out of school for about a month, and he recalled his mother having to plead with him to eat. As an enticement, several weeks after the funeral, she bought him his favorite Rocky Road ice cream, which he also refused. "If you let me see Daddy," he yelled at her, "I'll eat it." She was off work for quite a while and stayed in her bedroom with the door shut for the entire day. While Bill and I were focusing on this period in his life, he told me that the night before our meeting he had been thinking about his father and imagining how proud he would have been about Bill's success in business. But while having these thoughts, Bill had suddenly had what he described as a strange physical reaction. I was sitting in a dining room chair eating, and suddenly my body started shaking and my eyes started watering. I waited for Bill to continue, but he did not. "Were you crying? Sobbing?" Bill sat silently for several minutes without responding, then suddenly said, "Maybe that's what it was. I know I was very upset about my father. I've never done that before." "Cried? As a child?" "I don't know. I don't remember." What Bill had experienced as a strange physical reaction, he learned to recognize as an expression of emotion or grief. During his years in San Francisco, even while working as an escort, a fun way to make a decent living, Bill now recalled being terrified of becoming infected, sick, and dependent on others. He had almost completely repressed that fear of HIV, focusing instead on the task of remaining self-sufficient. That self-sufficiency has started early in childhood. By the time he was 9, 2 years after his father's death, he had learned to have the house clean and dinner prepared before his mother arrived home from work. My mother worked very hard, but was a slob and a very mediocre cook. I wasn't a good cook, but I was better than she was, and I stand on the step stool at the stove and make some pretty good dinners that I found in magazines. His mother was thankful for the dinners, but she also warned him, "If you tell people about this, they're going to think you're a fag." At the age of 9, Bill didn't quite know what she meant, but he uncomfortably sensed that she was right about something, and he never told anyone. Against the possibility of losing his self-sufficiency in San Francisco, Bill had been meticulously careful in his sexual activity and amassed a good stash of money. I once said to him, "In a relationship, you'd be like the man who has everything. You wouldn't know what to give him for Christmas. You appear to need nothing from others, and people feel that." Bill accepted my comment as a compliment for what he considered his primary virtue and only later understood its connection to his loneliness. His admirable and authentic independence and self-sufficiency hid a lifetime of grief that he had never allowed himself to experience or think consciously about. Now that he had clearly survived and then some, he had begun feeling that he had nothing purposeful or important in his life, particularly a relationship. He now often sobbed in grief about all that he did not have and had never had. Bill and I spent a considerable amount of time talking through his grief and then working it through. As he acknowledged and experienced the grief, he came to feel both stronger and weaker. Stronger because, in recognition of the emotional needs he had always had, he now understood himself more authentically. And weaker precisely because he had these needs and could no longer live with the self-sufficiency that he had always thought essential. I feel as if I've met myself for the first time in my life, and it's scary. and I'm pretty sure I don't like it. As Bill further explored and settled into some acceptance of his feelings, the next step would be working through his insights by implementing them in an attempt at a relationship that he very much wanted. For several months, Bill had been dating Kenny, and though Bill was more reserved in his description, my observation was that he had become very attached. He spoke about Kenny a lot, sometimes almost with a certain rapture, and on a Tuesday, Bill came in and told me about their spending Sunday night together at Bill's house. We were lying in bed, cuddling, spooning, and talking about the movie we'd been to. I was looking at the skin on the back of his neck. The next thing I knew, I was weeping and just clutching him. I couldn't let go of him. I was very embarrassed. Why embarrassed? I wondered. I don't know. For him to see me like that, and he wriggled around so he was facing me, and I think I had practically suffocated him, holding on to him like that, and he said what you always say to me, "Tell me what you're feeling," and then I just started sobbing again, and I couldn't stop. It sounds as if Kenny offered a supportive response. Yes, I thought about that, and I think that's part of what's bothering me now. How did you answer him? What were you feeling? I couldn't answer him. I didn't know. I said, I don't know. And why would his supportiveness bother you? I don't know. Do you know? Maybe, I'm not sure, but it would be better to know what you think. I think I'm afraid of needing him. That's what I've been afraid of all my life. When I was looking at the back of his neck, at his beautiful skin, I was thinking, this is a person with a body. He could get something. It could just go in through his skin, and he could die. And I couldn't bear that. Bill felt silent. I waited before responding. In an important way, other people are all we have in life. But we sometimes lose them. You already lost a lot of people. Falling in love is a risk. Bill was silent for a moment, then began sobbing. Bill's own analysis of what had happened that night with Kenny was a reminder of how much insight Bill had gained in our talking through his lifetime of loss and trauma. In the next step, working through, which would not be his reconnection, but his first adult connection, he would have to consciously incorporate his insight into how he lived. I described the process to Bill. We flag certain issues and situations that provoke familiar, problematic responses, and we learn to consciously recognize the flagged items as they come up in our lives. Feeling attached to others, and thus dependence, was an important flag for Bill. When a flag comes up, we think about the situation and possible responses to it, and about what each of the possible responses would mean and accomplish. We then make conscious choices to not respond in habitual, destructive ways. We decide to behave differently and evaluate the outcome. Over time, I told Bill this process of working through changes how we experience ourselves, how others experience us, and how we experience our lives. But this seems impossible, Bill objected. When I told you about that night with Kenny, I didn't understand it until 2 days later. What's important is that you did finally understand it, which was a real accomplishment, and you did express feelings to Kenny, even if you couldn't articulate what they were about. Anyway, 2 days is pretty good for something that complicated. With practice, we get more familiar faster. It's a slow process. How slow? I don't know. Slow. The idea isn't to be perfect, to expect yourself to always be on the spot. You know, you can apologize later to someone and change the outcome then. Some things you can redo and some you can't. A week later, you can explain to Kenny what you were feeling if you want to. Over time, These efforts bring incremental, little changes, and the accumulation begins to change our lives. It's slow, and you need to have patience with yourself. What I'm describing here is how we change, the only way we change. We don't change just because we understand something. We change when we put our understanding to use. Bill and I still continue to meet occasionally when he has something to talk about, and he is now barely recognizable as the person I first met. The resolute cheerfulness is gone, and in its place one senses an authentic, more complex person, one who is appropriately cheerful. Bill and Kenny now live together, and Bill continues to grow by working through his still increasing insight. On a recent visit, Bill said to me, "When you said slow, you meant slow." I don't know, you seem like a different person from the man I met a few years ago. In any case, it's a lifelong process. That's how we grow. When we stop growing, that's the end. Oh, I know I'm completely different. When I think about it, I'm really shocked at how little I understood before, but I'm hardly perfect. I'm still learning. If you were perfect, you'd be the first one. Give yourself some slack for the wonderful work you've done. Really, give yourself some slack. Bill has, I think, significantly recovered from his lifelong composite trauma. He now lives with a kind of genuine lightness, spontaneity, and, most importantly, sense of himself in connection to others that was unimaginable when I first met him. But Bill is not over his grief. He is more consciously aware of it than he had ever been. He has truthfully revealed himself to himself, and he has come to some acceptance of the grief he has lived with. Herman describes the complexity of self-exploration and resolution. The goal of recounting the trauma story is integration, not exorcism. In the process of reconstruction, the trauma story does undergo a transformation, but only in the sense of becoming more present and more real. The fundamental premise of the psychotherapeutic work is a belief in the restorative power of truth-telling. In the telling, the trauma story becomes a testimony. On another recent visit, Bill said to me, "I don't really know what therapy is exactly or how it works, but I know that over the last few years, well, I don't know exactly how to put it. I'm living in my own life for the first time. It's very different, a very different feeling. And I have Kenny, which would have been impossible before. I don't really understand how it all happened." The answer was relatively simple. Bill had become himself by having someone support him in finding and being himself. He had had a witness, and for that now had a richer, if more complicated, life.